All right, we're going to get started. Go ahead and grab a seat. We're going to get started here in just a second. Wow, that was quick. Awesome. Well, welcome back to the CCU students. This is our Distinguished Lecture Series hosted by the Centennial Institute, by the President's Office, and by Colorado Christian University. You know, it is a strategic priority of Colorado Christian University to impact our culture and support of Western civilization, and that is what tonight's talk is primarily going to cover. So we're so glad that you're going to be here. Everyone have a good weekend? Very good. So I was cooking pancakes for my kids over the weekend, and this is something I do a lot of times on the weekends. I'm getting breakfast ready, and we kind of have a slower morning, and so we were making pancakes, and my sons were fighting over who got the first pancake. And I thought to myself, well, this is a great moment to kind of talk about Jesus and about morals. So I said to them, you know, if Jesus were here, he would say that his brother could have the first pancake. And my son looks at his brother and says, well, you can be Jesus. Well, we had a wonderful summer. I got to tell you, the campus is not the same without our students here. We're so glad to have you back. There's so much energy and excitement as the Lord prepares you for a lifetime of service as you go out into this world to glorify him in whatever field that you choose. So we're so glad to have you back. We had a wonderful Western Conservative Summit. 2,300 attendees from 38 states, heard from over 50 speakers. We had dozens of workshops, over 60 exhibitors. It was one of the largest Western Conservative Summits we've ever had. And do we have the ability to showcase the Western Conservative Summit right now? Walter's going to get that going. I wanted to show you a little bit of a review of what we were able to achieve through the Western Conservative Summit. It was a lot of fun. Nearly 100 media outlets were covering it. It was a big event. So if you missed it, be sure to check out the Western Conservative Summit for next year. But we have a little recap video.
There is no place better to be than right here in Colorado for the largest conservative gathering in the Western United States.
That's Donald Trump Jr., Ben Carson, Michelle Malkin, Dan Crenshaw, Charlie Kirk. We even had a jam session with Robert George. It was a lot of fun.
Make sure that the America that we all grew up in, the freedoms that we all have grown to love from the days of our founding fathers are there forever.
So it was a absolutely wonderful event, and I hope you can be a part of it next year. This was our 10th Western Conservative Summit. It really has become a force, a center of gravity in the state of Colorado, in the western region, where we have all these leaders coming and talking about the issues that we're facing, and wonderful workshops to educate people on important issues. So the next year's one will be June 12th through the 13th as we continue that great legacy. All right, as we begin, I want to welcome 1776 scholars Sarah Morris and Lena Pacifici to come up here and lead us in prayer and the Pledge of Allegiance. So can you join us by standing if you can? Thank you.
Dear Lord Jesus, I want to thank you first and foremost that we have the opportunity to gather here tonight and to listen to a great speaker like Bradley Birzer on a topic that is so important in the founding of our country and our nation. I thank you, Lord. In your name, amen.
Please join me for the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, you may be seated. I want to recognize a few folks that I saw in the audience. We have a few elected officials here. So if you are an elected official, whether a CU region elected official or Mark Baisley, I see you over there, State Representative Mark Baisley, can you stand so we can recognize you? Thank you for coming and being a part of this. I know we also have a member of the Board of Trustees here. Maybe I missed one of the other ones, but Dr. Jerry Nelson, thank you for joining us. And then, of course, the president of Colorado Christian University is doing such a great job leading this university. Friends, can we welcome Dr. Donald Sweeting, the president of CCU. That was great. So we have a wonderful speaker who's an expert in history, and I was reading about an event that happened with Calvin Coolidge just the other day that I thought was interesting to share. Calvin Coolidge was, one of our presidents, and he had invited a family to come to the White House to join him for dinner. And the family was very nervous, and they said, well, I don't know if we're as well-mannered as the president and we can, eat with him. So they decided to get together and said, you know what we're going to do? We'll just mimic everything that the president does. So whatever he does, we'll do, and I'm sure we can get through this dinner just fine. So the dinner's going just fine, and they're getting it through, and then dessert comes, and they bring coffee and the fixings for coffee out, and they notice that Calvin Coolidge takes off the coffee off the saucer, and he puts milk in a saucer. They kind of look at each other and go, okay, well, so they put milk in their saucer. And they notice Calvin Coolidge takes a little bit of sugar, and he kind of sprinkles it in his saucer too. Okay, well, let's do that too. So they take some sugar and sprinkle it in their saucer, and then Calvin Coolidge takes the saucer and bends down and gives it to the cat. Weren't sure what to do at that point. Well, friends, we're so grateful to have Dr. Bradley Birzer here. Over the last 30 years, Western civilization has become synonymous in many quarters with racism, sexism, darkness, and oppression. In this talk, Dr. Bradley Birzer will take down these myths, noting that the West has traditionally embraced human dignity through voluntary sacrifice. He will trace the West from the first philosopher to the American founding. Dr. Bradley Birzer is a professor of history and Russell Amos Kirk Chair in American Studies at Hillsdale College, where he has served on the faculty since 1999. Dr. Birzer earned a BA from the University of Notre Dame, an MA in history from Utah State University, and a PhD in history from Indiana University. He teaches courses on the Civil War, the American West, Native Americans, Jacksonian America, the 20th century Christian humanism. In 2002 and 2003, Dr. Birzer was voted Professor of the Year by Hillsdale College students. Dr. Birzer has written in defense of Andrew Jackson, Russell Kirk, American conservative. Am I pronouncing it right? Neil Peart? Yes. Cultural Repercussions, American Cicero, Charles Carroll of Carrollton, Sanctifying the World, The Augustinian Life and Mind of Christopher Dawson, and JRR Tolkien's Sanctifying Myth. Friends, we are so very grateful to have with us tonight Dr. Bradley Birzer.
Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you all for coming. This is great. Oh, I see people I hadn't seen before. This is good. Thank you, and I've got this, well, I don't want to single you out, but these are our friends from CU days. So anyway, this is very good. Let me just thank a number of people here. So unfortunately, she couldn't make it tonight because this is her anniversary for her wedding, but Amy Lake organized much of this, and she did a great job for getting all of this together. Jeff Hunt, thank you very much for your nice introduction and for everything else. It's been a great day. And I don't know, is Gary Stewart, are you in here? There's Gary. Yeah, Gary had me to his class this morning, and I got to meet several of the students and had a really great time. And then at lunch today, I got to eat with President Sweeting and had a really wonderful time, and then a great dinner tonight, which was slightly intimidating. I actually had dinner with about 12 faculty, and they were asking a lot of hard questions. But anyway, hopefully I answered them well. It felt like I was getting my PhD again, but it was great. So I hope I lived up to their expectations. So as Jeff said, tonight I want to talk about the meaning of Western civilization. And I don't know how many of you have had a chance, but the New York Times has done some very interesting things recently. And about a month ago, and I find this very disturbing because the New York Times, along with the Wall Street Journal, really should be one of our two most reputable newspapers. But about a month ago, In August of 2019, they announced what they call the 1619 Project, which is an attempt to reorient all of American history, which really means, as I hope will kind of be obvious here, meaning Western civilization and modern history, that they would like to reorient it so that we think of the real founding of America from the moment that the first African Americans were sold at Jamestown in 1619, that we're now in the 400th anniversary. So I'm going to just read from their website and how they state this. They have a number of very interesting things under it, including something that I had to really scratch my head at. They talked about how the plantation is the ultimate example of capitalism gone wrong. And I'm trying to imagine how slave labor fits into a free market system. I'm having a very difficult time reconciling that. But regardless, this is what the New York Times says. The 1619 Project is a major initiative of the New York Times observing the 400th anniversary of the beginning of American slavery. It aims to reframe the country's history, understanding 1619 as our true founding. Now, just imagine that for a moment. Imagine if everything that we celebrated, and I know that many of you in this room, not all of you, but many of you in this room remember the bicentennial and the kinds of things we did to celebrate the bicentennial. Imagine if all of American history was defined not by this one glorious moment in 1776, but by the greatest crime we've ever committed. I mean, can you imagine if this is what we base ourselves on? And I in no way want to downplay that history of slavery. It has been a horrible history, and heinous things were done without question. And I'm sorry I used the passive there. Were done, right? Heinous things were done. Many people did heinous things. It is a terrible, terrible tragedy, and it's a terrible part of our history. But it is by no means the only part of our history. And yet, what we see with the New York Times and their attacks over the last month on American history are really not that unusual when we consider the way that history has been taught for almost 50 years now. Since the late 1960s, it has been very much the agenda then of the New Left, now just of the left and the progressives in general, that they would play the long game, that they would infiltrate culture, that they would move into education, both primary education and higher education, that they would get their ideas out, not immediately, not in politics. They weren't going to do that with people like McGovern, but they could do it very slowly and very confidently over time by taking over cultural institutions. And I think that we only have to look, and I don't mean to be too prejudiced or too biased about this, but not only do we have to look at the state of most universities, but look at what happened in most seminaries in the Catholic Church. Look at what's happened in those institutions where we've also seen the same kind of people moving in, and we've seen the same kind of damage that they've done in a variety of different ways. So these attacks on the West and on Western civilization really over the last several generations, as Jeff very nicely said in his introduction, almost all come down to the story that Western civilization is about slavery, it's about imperialism, it's about exploitation. It is ultimately about racism and sexism. And again, I in no way want to say that those things did not happen, but I also think it should be very clear that those things were in context and they were a part of a larger history in which very good things did happen, despite the negative things that we see there. And so I started thinking, and I was thinking about this as I was preparing for this talk. Where are we right now in 2019? Where are we in terms of Western civilization? How do we think about ourselves? And I don't think it's a very pretty picture, at least if we're looking at the way that our cultural elites have painted this. But then I was reminded of how terrible things have been at other times as well. And I had to go back to one of my favorite Romans, Marcus Cicero, and look at what he wrote right before he was executed. And we think we have it bad at times. Cicero was hunted down at his villa, where Mark Antony ordered that his head and his hands were removed physically from his body as a part of his murder. And then they actually took his head back to the Roman Senate and mounted it on the Senate rostra, where Mark Antony then gave a speech that the old republic was dead. So we may be down, we may be upset, we may think that things are really not going well right now in Western civilization. We're not in Marcus Cicero's position at this moment. And right before this, he wrote about the nature of his own republic, and he writes beautifully about where the Romans were roughly around 44 BC, right at the fall of the Roman Republic. He says, before our time, the customs of our ancestors produced excellent men, and eminent men preserved our ancient customs and the institutions of our forefathers. But though the Republic, when it came to us, was like a beautiful painting whose colors were already fading with age, our own time has not only neglected to freshen the painting by renewing its original colors, but has not even taken the trouble to preserve its outlines. For what is now left of the ancient customs which once created the Republic of Rome, which made Rome firm? They have been, as we see, so completely buried in oblivion that they are not only no longer practiced, but they are almost completely unknown. And what shall I say of these men? For the loss of our customs is due to our lack of men, and for this great evil we must one day give an account, and we must defend ourselves in every way possible, as though we personally have been accused of murder. For it is through our own faults, and not by any accident, that we retain the name Republic, but have long since lost its essence. Now, that's 44 BC. Could we not say that in 2019, right? This is something that still plagues us. And certainly this is part of living in a republic. We worry about its fall. It's a part of who and what we are. We try and understand our position within it. But there have been very dark days, and then there have been very, very dark days, and then there have been very, very, very dark days. We happen to just live in the dark days. We're not quite at the very, very, very dark days. So I want to make an argument that has three parts to it for tonight's lecture. An argument that argues, in fact, that the West was not founded based on exploitation or an understanding of trying to diminish the human person, but in fact was based instead about trying to find something universal in who and what we are as persons, regardless of skin color, regardless of ethnicity, regardless of what our religion is, but that the West was rooted in trying to find something common. And so if we go back, even before Marcus Cicero, if we go back to about 500 BC, we find this amazing moment in history in which we find this both in Hindu culture as well as in budding Confucianism and Buddhism, and also in Greece, in which there's this kind of grand moment, an almost raising of consciousness, in which the great thinkers of that time, in each of those major cultures of civilization, began to think not merely in terms of how do I treat my neighbor, but how do I treat the person who lives across the river from me? How do I live with the people who are over in that country or in this city, as opposed to just those who live next to us? Clearly, when we look at our own heritage of the Judeo-Christian heritage, and we look at what the Jews were doing, what the ancient Hebrews were doing, they had an excellent understanding of how to treat one another. But there becomes a greater question: how do we treat not only our neighbor, but those who don't necessarily look like us? And within all of those major cultures around 500 BC, we see the development of what we would call philosophy, this rise of a questioning, of trying to figure out who and what we are as human persons. For us in the Western tradition, this mostly took place on the coast of what's now Turkey, in a city that's now unfortunately underwater, but a city called Miletus, where we see a number of figures coming together in this place, trying to understand who and what we are, trying to understand what holds us together. And when we look at those very first philosophers, people like Heraclitus and others, they were worried about the human condition because they believed that we as humans were trapped in cycles. They thought that all of life simply existed of being born, then becoming corrupt through middle age, and then dying. And yet they wondered, well, how does the human person continue in all of that? And they thought the same thing about the seasons. Why is it that when we look at the seasons, we see a spring, and then a summer, and then a fall, and a winter, but we don't see a fifth thing? We go back to that first thing, to spring, and we keep repeating this. And so these great philosophers thought, what could be the origin of this? Could we be fire? Could we be water? Could we be air? Could we be earth? These were the questions that they asked. What caused the cycle, and would it be possible for us to break out of it? And again, in the Western tradition, we come to one person I've already mentioned who's incredibly important for us, one of the great earliest philosophers, Heraclitus, who decided that the human person is based on the idea of fire, that we are essentially eternal fire. And as far as we know, he had to coin a term for this. And the term that he used was the term logos, which meant this being of creativity and imagination, this fire. And of course, we know that the way that this term plays out through the Stoics and then later through the Christians, we find that the very word logos becomes central to who and what we are as human beings, this defining element for who and what we are, how we see ourselves, and how we see others. But it's not just in philosophy. I would turn to my second point. And that is an argument that we find in the Western tradition, especially in the Socratic and Platonic tradition. We find this desire for the human person to engage in ideas of virtue, that we must act in certain ways towards one another, that it's not merely enough that we have free will, and they weren't always sure that we use that free will well, but that within that understanding, we also treated one another with certain forms of dignity. And we find in one of the great Platonic dialogues, one called the Symposium, we find the participants mentioning in the Symposium that they believe that there are 4 virtues, and they list these as prudence, justice, temperance, and fortitude. Now, I don't know how many of you recently have read a Platonic dialogue. For you students, I know that you'll be reading them soon, and there's no way that you'll be graduating from college without looking through the Platonic dialogues. At Hillsdale, where I teach, we teach one of the dialogues right at the end of Socrates' life as he is willing to accept the hemlock, called the Crito, where he's talking to his very good friend Crito. Crito's very upset. Don't do this, Socrates. We can get you out of here. We can escape, and so forth. And any of you who've ever had a chance to read a Socratic dialogue, they argue about everything. Nothing is unchallenged. Everything is challenged. Everything is questioned. And yet, in the Symposium, when one of the characters says, and we all agree in prudence, justice, temperance, and fortitude, there is no argument. Praise be, right? There is no argument. And we as historians take that as this must have been something that was absolutely set in the Greek culture, that they had believed in this at this point when we get to the Symposium. And when we think about these ideas of prudence, prudence properly defined is the ability to discern good from evil, the first of all the virtues. We must be able to choose, we must be able to decide, is this thing good or is it evil? Justice. Do we allow for a thing to have its proper place? Not just the human being, but all creatures in existence. Do we understand where they are established? What is their role within society? Temperance, connected so closely to the idea of prudence. If prudence is the ability to discern good from evil, temperance is the use of created goods only for good things. So when we look at something like the tree, how do we use the tree? Is the tree meant to give us only shade? Or can we tear it down and use it in construction? Or could we build a crucifix? Right? All these things are possibilities. And temperance begs us to ask, what do we do with the created goods? And then we get to that really complicated fourth of the 4 virtues. And that is, what is fortitude? Fortitude tells us that we must do what is right no matter the cost. Doesn't sound a lot like prudence, doesn't fit in quite perfectly with temperance, but the idea of fortitude, no matter the cost, we must do what's right. This is the last of the 4 pagan or cardinal virtues. Later, of course, we'll see in Christianity, Paul through God, or God through Paul, adding on faith, hope, and love. But at this point, this is what we have. We have prudence, justice, temperance, and fortitude. And I want to talk for a moment about fortitude. I think this is a key virtue to understand who and what we are as a people. And I think when we think about where we are now in our present society, when we consider what is important for us in our own actions, not only understanding what we've inherited from the past, but what we're willing to pass on to our children, we have to think about the issue of fortitude. And I want to take us back to the Greeks, but I want to take us back to the weird Greeks, not to the Greeks that we generally think of as our ancestors. So almost all of us, despite the fact the Athenians kill Socrates, we generally like to think that if we're Greek at all, we're Greek like the Athenians. We don't usually think too much about the Corinthians. We don't think about the Spartans, and yet the Spartans are really important, and especially when it comes to fortitude. So many of you may know one of the greatest moments in Western civilization, really the beginning of Western civilization, was a massive conflict between this huge, using the old-fashioned term Orient, this huge Oriental power, Persia, which was ruled by a god king, and then all of the Greek city-states, about 150 of them, all with different political systems. Corinth was nothing like Thessaly. Thessaly was nothing like Athens. They each had their own political understanding, but what held the Greeks together was a common idea of language and, to a certain extent, religion as well, and their polytheism. But this is what held them together. And when the great god kings of Persia looked to the west, when they looked to what would have been called the Occident, so from the Orient looking to the Occident, when they looked through the Aegean and they saw what was happening in Greece, they were deeply offended by the Greeks. It didn't matter that the Spartans had a dual monarchy. The Spartans believed that they were free. They believed that they were not ruled by a god king, and this greatly upset the Persians. The Persians lived by the rule of a god king, and they believed it was essential that they establish that rule wherever and whenever possible. And so through incredible hubris and arrogance and some mischief making on the part of the Greeks, the Persians decide to go to war against the Greeks. And this is a war that lasts from roughly 500 BC until 479 BC. And during that time, we have three massive invasions by the Persians. But during one of the greatest and last of the invasions, in 480 BC, Xerxes, the great Persian leader, sends a force of almost 100,000 men, plus his navy, to go against the Greeks. The Greeks, of course, get wind of this, and in particular, the man who is leading the Greek charge against this is one of the dual monarchs of Sparta, a man by the name of Leonidas. He has heard from the oracle at Delphi that he is to have some kind of eternal existence. That is, his reputation will continue. Not a physical heaven, but his reputation will continue. And it will either continue as a man regarded as a horrible figure in history, or he will go down with great fame. That is, he will be remembered throughout the ages. And one of our earliest historians, a man by the name of Herodotus, writes about this. And Herodotus, in his history, writes beautifully about the Persian invasion of the Greeks and tries to describe what was going on in the psychology of Xerxes as he saw these Spartans being led by Leonidas with only 300 men and a few allies holding off 100,000 Persians. So just imagine that for a moment. You've got roughly 300 plus Greeks holding off 100,000 battle-hardened Persians. So this is an incredible conflict of civilizations, but it's also a great disparate number in terms of troops, and we would think that the Persians should be able to wipe out the Greeks immediately. But Herodotus, describing the advent of Greek patriotism, writes, Xerxes was not persuaded any the more. 4 whole days he suffered to go by, expecting that the Greeks would simply run away. When, however, he found on the 5th the Greeks had not gone, he thought their firm stand was mere impudence and recklessness, and he grew wroth, and he sent his best troops against the Greeks with orders to take the Greeks alive and bring them to his presence. You can imagine what he's going to do to them if he can capture them and bring them. He's going to torture them, he's going to interrogate them, he's going to try and figure out what is it that drives them. Herodotus continues, Then the Persians rushed forward and they charged the Greeks, but the Persians fell in vast numbers. Others took their places. They took the places of the slain, but they too were beaten off. The Greeks could not be challenged, and though they too suffered terrible losses, they suffered nothing like the Persians. For in this way it became clear to all, but especially to Xerxes, that though he had plenty of soldiers, he had no men. Now, I want you to imagine that for a moment. Now, granted, Herodotus is a Greek patriot, even though he himself is from the Turkish coast, most likely. We don't actually know a lot about him. But he identified at least with the colonists of Athens, and he thought of himself as somewhat of an Athenian. So here we have Herodotus, who's writing about this, and notice what he says. What distinguishes the Spartans, who would not be the most beloved people of Greece? These were people who not only had their dual monarchy, but they lived in a very martial, militaristic fashion, very different from what many of the other Greeks had lived like. And yet they shared in that idea of Greekness, of Hellas. They shared that. And what does Herodotus tell us? The enemy had no real men, no people who could think for themselves. Every one of them was a slave to their god king. They could not be independent. And Herodotus tells us that even the Spartans, who may be the least freest among the Greeks, have more freedom and understanding of what they're doing than the Persians do. And this accounts for the defeat. Now, ultimately, however, the Persians are successful, and they do take out all 300 of the Spartans. But it's that moment of intense patriotism, that awakening in the Greek spirit that is put forth because of this sacrifice of Leonidas and his men, that what we can really say, and I know this is one of those throwing down the gauntlet moments, but I think it's absolutely true. Western civilization was born at the moment the last Spartan died. This is where the West really came into existence. And I would ask for you to think about this for a moment in those first 2 points I wanted to make. That number one, from the beginning, we have this desire to find something universal to understand who and what we are, this element of oneness, this element of likeness in the human being. But number two, we also see this desire to put forth the virtues. That is, to believe that through the virtues, we can attain somehow a certain kind of glory or greatness. And in particular, here we have fortitude. So we put together some of the great things of Heraclitus, the idea of this common human person, and then we put together that with Herodotus, this idea that we can defeat those who are trying to challenge us because they don't understand their own freedom. And this leads to my third point. And that is, and I turn back to what we have beautifully here with the Centennial Institute and with Colorado Christian University, we have this notion of these two beautiful things that come together, grace and truth. And I want to try and pull this together and explain how this comes together for understanding what Western civilization is. So if we think about the West, notice I've already given you two examples of sacrifice. One I went over very quickly. The idea of Cicero, and Cicero knowing that he is to be taken out and basically submitting himself at age 69 to the powers that be, hoping, of course, that something will come of this. And we're still talking about Cicero. Here we are over 2,000 years later. We're still talking about him. And certainly when we look at the American founding, there was no figure more beloved by the American founders than Cicero. He was everywhere in the American founding, to the point that when I had the privilege of teaching at the University of Colorado at Boulder, I taught a course basically called Cicero's Founding, where we looked at all of the influences of Rome in particular, Tacitus, Livy, Virgil, and Cicero, those influences on the American founders. One of my favorite of the American founders, a man that I've had the privilege of spending time with, at least intellectually, not physically, but intellectually, a man by the name of Charles Carroll of Carrollton, who was the very last of the signers of the Declaration to die. He died on November 14th of 1832 at the age of 95, outlived all the other signers of the Declaration. When he was interviewed at the end of his life, asking, at age 94, 95, how do you keep yourself together? You know that all of the men that you brought about this republic with are gone. How do you keep yourself whole in all of this? And he pointed to his bookstand next to his chair where he had the New Testament and he had On Friendship by Cicero. And he said, well, Cicero and Jesus are my best friends. I talk to them daily and they listen. This is how powerful this image was in the American founding of this Roman founding and these Romans. So I've given you Cicero, but we've also seen that sacrifice with Leonidas. And then we can take it further. The one that should jump out for all of us, who is beyond and above everyone I've mentioned, Jesus Christ. And he's not the only one. We can think of others throughout all of the Western tradition who have given themselves over for what they believe, given themselves over for something greater than themselves. And so I want to pull this together by mentioning a couple of people and also thinking about what this time period is and why I think this time period is much better than we often give it credit for. I'm going to quote from 3 people. All of them I admire greatly. All of them, I think, believe deeply in the idea of grace and truth. The first I want to quote from is the founder of post-war conservatism, a man by the name of Russell Kirk, born in 1918, passed away in April of 1994. He wrote a book in 1953 called The Conservative Mind. It's a beautiful, brilliant book. It was his dissertation. He never meant for it to do what it did. It became a many time bestseller. In fact, it sold well over 1 million copies during its life. Incredible achievement for a dissertation. Kirk tried to respond to his critics. So between about 1948 and 1952, he wrote this book, The Conservative Mind, as his dissertation. It was published. Everyone reviewed it. It made a major splash in American and British culture in 1953. But there were all kinds of people who said, Kirk doesn't go far enough. Here he's got this book called The Conservative Mind. We come out at the other end of the book and we don't even really know what a conservative is. And Kirk, of course, thought this was outrageous because his whole book was on the dignity of the human person. What is conservatism? Conservatism means we conserve the dignity of the human person. And that means something that we can see over time, through time, really across time. So in the sequel to this book, which he wrote almost a chapter a night, a book called A Program for Conservatives, and the title is meant to be mocking. He's making fun of those people who are demanding that conservatism have some kind of litmus test to define it. Kirk responds in the very end of his first chapter. He says, and now I would like to address my critics, and I will do so by asking a very important question. In fact, I will ask a question that is at the heart of everything. That is, what is the object of human life? And this is what I have found. The conservative, the true conservative, will never believe that the end or aim of life is competition, or success, or enjoyment, or longevity, or power, or possession. Now, let me repeat that, because I think that's beautiful, and I think it goes against so much of the stereotype against conservatives. He does not believe the aim of life is competition, or success, or enjoyment, or longevity, or power, or possession. He believes instead that the one object of life is love. He knows that the just and ordered society is that in which love governs us, so far as love can ever reign in this world of sorrows, and he knows that the anarchical and the tyrannical society is that in which love has become corrupt. He has learnt that love is the source of all being, and that hell itself was ordained by love. And he understands that death, when we have finished the part that was assigned to us, is the greatest reward of love. But he apprehends this one truth, that the greatest happiness of any man that has ever been granted to any man is that the man has the privilege of being happy in the hour of his death. Now, that is utterly profound, to think about what is the object of life, and we cannot understand it without understanding the transition to the eternal phase. We cannot get that. No matter how much we think about our 70 or our 80, or if we're really blessed, our 90 or 100 years, nothing compared to eternity. And yet, what Kirk is arguing here is not the kind of fame that Leonidas was seeking. Leonidas sought a certain kind of fame. He wanted to go down in glory. He wanted it, desperately wanted it. He wanted his name to be remembered as someone who died for the greatness of his civilization. Kirk is talking about a different kind of love. His love is not about the love of the individual. It's about the love of the human being as understood within the element of creation. It's understanding the human being as a created being, now as a sub-creator, but as a created being. And so I turn to my second person I would like to quote from, my favorite writer of the 20th century, JRR Tolkien, who was asked once by W.H. Auden, the great poet, and his student, Auden asked him, "What do you really think about allegory?" Because Tolkien was famous for hating allegory as a literary form. And Tolkien said, "Let me tell you the one positive of allegory. Every person is an allegory. Every person embodies in a particular tale and is clothed in the garments of time and place, universal truth, and everlasting life." Now, again, imagine that. What is the human being? Every human being is an unrepeatable center of dignity and freedom, never to come again. There will never be that human being again. A moment, a flicker, an 80-year life, whatever it may be, right? This is it. And yet, next to eternity, it still matters. It's not unimportant. It's not inconsequential. And so I'm not asking that we think as Leonidas did, but I do want us to understand that the West was born in sacrifice. It was born in fortitude, and it is sustained by love. It is grace and truth. So let me turn to the last person that I would like to talk about, and I'm going to quote most extensively from him, and there's a reason for this. And I don't know how many of you realize this, and it didn't hit me until today. And I emailed Gary right away, and I said, "Gary, I didn't bring this. I need you to print this off for me." He very graciously did. We are in the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. We all remember that? That's coming up in November, the 30th anniversary. This is incredible. And I would argue that not only is this simply important to who and what we are, I would say it's absolutely essential for us to understand. Because for those of you who remember 1976, no matter how much we might have celebrated the bicentennial, that was a bleak year. And you may remember a couple of years later, in 1979 and 1980, these were even more bleak. And they were just as bleak as things may have seemed about 3 years ago. They were deeply bleak. And yet, Ronald Reagan arose, and Ronald Reagan gave America an incredible confidence that America had always had. But Reagan was able to convince America that hope and confidence actually mattered. So I want to turn to this, not just what happens in 1989, but what leads up to it. So I have it in my wallet here. I won't pull it out right now, but I carry this with me. And there's probably something a little superstitious about it, but we won't go there. I still carry with me my ticket from May 17th of 1981, Ronald Reagan giving his speech to the graduating class of the University of Notre Dame. I was only in 7th grade at that point. I was 13, but my oldest brother was graduating that year. And Reagan, this was his very first appearance. For those of you who are my age or older, you will remember, of course, he was almost assassinated. And this was his very first public appearance after the assassination attempt. So for you students, I realize this is long before you, but I promise you this is worth looking up. And it wasn't just Reagan who was shot in that spring of 1989. Pope John Paul II was nearly assassinated as well. In fact, that bullet got a little bit closer to the Pope's heart than the one that Reagan got in the lung got him. But people thought they were both done at the moment that happened. So Reagan's first public appearance was at Notre Dame, and it was a tradition for presidents going all the way back to Eisenhower, and in fact, all the way back to William Tecumseh Sherman and Ulysses S. Grant, that people coming out of certain victories would come speak at Notre Dame every odd year, especially every 4th year. And it kind of lines up with the presidential elections. There's kind of a neat history to that. But if you look back, Jimmy Carter's speech in 1977 was not an attractive speech. That's where he talked about the communists. Basically, we have an inordinate fear of who and what they are, and that was at Notre Dame as well. So Reagan's going to answer that. So Reagan has barely survived this assassination attempt. He's come out of it probably much stronger and better than he was before. In fact, and I'm sorry I have all these little trivias about Reagan in my head, but Reagan actually worked out so much. He was 70 at the time he was shot. He worked out so much after he was shot that he put up 2 full additional inches of muscle on his chest between ages 70 and 72. The guy was stunning in every way. But before I start getting into weird territory, let me just say what Reagan said in 1981 at Notre Dame. So remember, he's speaking to the graduating class of 1981. So for you students, These are people your age. And he says to them, my brother at the time, we need you. We need your youth. We need your strength. We need your idealism to help us make right all that is wrong. Now, I know that at this period in your life, you have been and are critically looking at all the mores and customs of the past, and you're questioning their value. Every generation does this. May I suggest that you don't discard the time-tested values upon which our civilization was built simply because they're old. More importantly, don't let today's doom criers and cynics, and again, I realize that you had to have been there, but in 1981, the idea that the Soviet Union would collapse or that America would recapture her former glory after the defeats in Vietnam and Cambodia were laughable for much of the public. Americans were truly dispirited in 1979 and 1980, especially after the Iranian hostage situation. A horrible moment to be an American, and yet Reagan saw past all of that. Most importantly, don't let today's doom criers and cynics persuade you that the best is past, that from here it's all downhill. Each generation sees a little farther than the generation preceded it because it stands on the shoulders of that generation. And this is Reagan's greatest moment in his speech. And I still remember this, even though I was only 13. I remember this pause he made, and then he went into this. He said, the years are great ones for this country, for the cause of freedom and the spread of civilization. The West will no longer contain communism. It will transcend communism. Now, you have to put that into context. Let me repeat that. The West will no longer contain communism. It will transcend communism. U.S. foreign policy, military policy, had been since 1945 under the containment strategy, 1946, under the containment strategy of Harry S. Truman, that whatever the Soviets did, we would counter them exactly. If they moved into one area, we would push them back to their border of 1946 and 47. If they built this number of missiles, we would build this number of missiles. Containment was based on the crazy idea of radical equality with the Soviet Union. Reagan is the first president, not Truman, not Eisenhower, not Kennedy, not Johnson, not Nixon, not Ford, and not Carter. Reagan is the very first president to understand you will never defeat the Soviets if it's only on material goals. It must be a spiritual battle. It has to be something greater. It has to be based on the definition and dignity of the human person. The West will no longer contain communism. It will transcend communism. It won't bother to dismiss it or denounce it. It will see it as a bizarre chapter in human history whose last pages are even now being written. Now, I've had the chance to go through and look at not all, but many of the newspaper articles from the time, and almost nobody quotes this passage. Almost nobody. They focus on the first part of Reagan's speech, which was about football. They focus on other things. Nobody quotes this except for two papers, Pravda and TASS. They both knew it was the headline. Reagan thinks he's a medieval crusader, is what TASS said about Reagan. They got it right. And of course, they should have been quaking because Reagan just launched the first salvo against the Soviet Union. And it was not a missile. It was much, much greater than a missile. It was a threat to their very definition of the human being. And then Reagan continues. This is not where we would expect him to go. William Faulkner once said that man will not only endure, he will prevail against the modern world because man alone has the old verities and truths written on his heart. And then Faulkner also said of man, he is immortal because he alone among creatures has a soul, a spirit capable of compassion and sacrifice and endurance. I love those three words. Compassion, sacrifice, and endurance. They're not quite as good as grace and truth, but they are really, really close. And when I think of conservatism, that's what I think of. I think of compassion, I think of sacrifice, and I think of endurance. When I think of Western civilization, yes, we've had our problems. We've had our racism. We've had our imperialism, sometimes horrible, sometimes genocidal. but we've almost always come back to right reason. And when we've come back to right reason, we have done so because somebody has pointed the way and reminded us of what is always true. Reagan continues. He says, one cannot think of those words, compassion, sacrifice, and endurance, without thinking of the irony that the one who so exemplifies them, Pope John Paul II, a man of peace and goodness, an inspiration to the entire world, would be struck by a bullet from a man towards whom he could only feel compassion and love. It was after John Paul II who warned us in last year's encyclical about how mercy and justice have been turned against certain people in the name of injustice, in the name to justify class struggle. President and I were talking about this at lunch today. Yeah, when we think about social justice warriors, they get two things right: justice and warrior. What they misunderstand is what true justice is. They misunderstand what it means, what the dignity of the human person is, and they start thinking in categories of race. They start thinking in categories of gender, and they cannot see the human person in front of them. They cannot see them. They are blind to the dignity of the human person. For the West and for America, Reagan said, the time has come to dare to show the world that our civilized ideas, our traditions, our values are not, like the ideologies and war machines of the totalitarian world, merely a facade of strength. It is time for the world to know that our intellectual and spiritual values are rooted in the source of all strength, a belief in a supreme being whose law is higher than our own. Now that's a commencement address. That is beautiful. That is what every commencement address should be like. But I want to end with this. Reagan got something absolutely right. And it wasn't just right in some kind of airy notion. It wasn't superficial, and it wasn't purely romantic. There were lots and lots and lots of people listening to Reagan. Most of them happened to be in Eastern Europe. And when they heard those words, they knew this is it. It doesn't matter if they revolt like they did in 53, or again in 56, or in 68, or 1979. This time it would mean something. This time they would have the backing of the West. And we now know that Reagan and John Paul II and Bill Casey, the head of the CIA, spent so much of the 1980s working to undermine the totalitarianisms of the East. And they succeeded. On November 9th of 1989, without a single shot being fired, thousands upon thousands of East Germans protested, and they brought down the Berlin Wall that night. I was a senior in college when that happened. Now, I just want you to think about that. I don't want to be too autobiographical, but I was a 7th grader when Reagan gave that speech. By the time I graduated college, the wall came down. Nobody would have expected that in my childhood, and I don't mean mine in particular, I mean that time period, nobody expected that the Soviet Union would be destroyed. So things are bad right now. We've got a lot of people who are out causing division. The New York Times, very irresponsibly, is causing division. China is causing division. Iran is causing division. We see this everywhere. It is a troubled, troubled world. But every single one of the truths that we've talked about tonight, everything that Heraclitus said, everything that Herodotus said, everything that Cicero said, everything that Reagan said, that Kirk said, that Tolkien said, these things are true forever. They're not just true at one moment in one time. They are true forever, for every people, every male, every female, black, white, does not matter. These truths are in existence. They are there. And what Reagan reminds us is that we merely need to remember these things. And when we remember them, we have to remember them with dignity. We have to remember them with hope. And most of all, if we learn anything from the pagans, from Leonidas, we learn that no matter what, we never give up the fight when we know it's correct. Thank you very much. My baby. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank these guys.
Great. That was wonderful, Dr. Birzer. We do have some time for some questions. Is that okay? Great. We do have a microphone that's going to be passed around. There's lots of people that are watching online, so please wait until you get the microphone to ask your question so that the people at home can hear you. So if you have a question, go ahead and raise your hand. We're right here.
Thank you very much, Dr. Birzer,
Thank
for
you.
a wonderful pay-on to Western civilization. I'm curious, from your perspective, what do you make about the seduction that we're seeing today toward communistic ideals? Clearly, there's a resurgence of communism in the world, including right here in the United States.
I'm horrified. It's just stunning how little we remember. It's everywhere now. You see it. It's become trendy, and this question is a great one because it's not what's. Let me answer this in a couple of different ways. So if we think about communism, what we're seeing now, and I think this was always true, but when the Soviet Union was our enemy, it was a little bit clearer than it is right now. China, of course, is not really communist, and yet it is. It's this amalgamation of a number of different things. The party line is communist, but obviously they've allowed for the free market to work in a variety of different ways in certain cities and certain sectors. So what we find now is, I think in 1950 or 1955, we could have defined this is a communism, this is this form of communism, this is this form. What we've seen now, and I think Saddam Hussein was actually one of the great examples of this, it's this almost complete blending of various forms of fascism and communism. And I don't actually think fascism and communism were ever that different. One was National Socialism, the other was International Socialism. But they both had much in common. But I think we've gotten to a point where theoretically, when we're talking about this and when young people are debating it, there's really no great distinction between this form of totalitarianism and this form, but we're seeing it in democracy as well. Democracy through free speech restrictions and other things, which is exactly what people like Alexis de Tocqueville worried about, that we would have a kind of soft totalitarianism in which our actions were not necessarily stopped, but we would stop thinking about taking those actions in the first place. This is how de Tocqueville defined what a democracy would be like if it ever became despotic, right? So it's not that we are told we can't do this. We're just not educated in a fashion where we even imagine that's a possibility at this point. So we keep getting narrower and narrower in our understanding. But the second thing I would answer to that, and again, I mean, a great question, we absolutely cannot, and we cannot forget the dead. When we look at who was killed by communist and fascist regimes in the 20th century, we have close to 205 million bodies that we know of who were killed. We have 21 million who were killed in the Holocaust camps in Nazi Germany, Poland, and the areas that the Nazis had taken over. But we have well over 100 million elsewhere from the various communists. In fact, more than that. We know that probably the Chinese under Mao were responsible for about 65 million. We know that Stalin was personally responsible for about 42 million. And then you add another 20 from the other Soviet dictators. So we're talking about huge numbers of bodies. And I would just think about that for a moment. Numbers become so large that they become almost unwieldy. But if we just take 205 as a low estimate, 205 million people killed by their own governments in the 20th century, currently, what are we in America at about 330 million? So take out 2 out of every 3 people you know? But these are not small numbers, right? One's enough. But when you're talking about 205 million, I mean, this is the legacy of communism and fascism in the 20th century. And we just can't forget this. We just can't. And no matter how many times these people say, well, this form hasn't been tried yet. Well, I don't know how many dead bodies we're going to get until we keep trying all of these different forms. So, yeah, please, you had a follow-up. Sure. Yeah, the question was, where did we lose kind of the moral understanding of this? When did it happen? I think it's been happening slowly. I think in large part, there's this equivalency that the new left had put in. I don't want to blame them solely. I mean, obviously, it's a complicated problem, and there are a lot of just average Americans who caved into that as well, who wouldn't be leftist or right. They just gave into it. So I think there were a lot of people who just kind of really gave up the ghost on that. academia has gone downhill pretty seriously, with the exception of a few institutions, not just since the 60s, but very dramatically over the last 30 years, especially. The narrowing of thought, the inability to think beyond our categories. I think there's that moral dimension. And I would also say, and here I just gave you a talk about how great it was Reagan brought the Soviet Union down, but I do think once we lost the Soviet Union, we lost our moral compass in some ways. We didn't have that enemy that we could define ourselves against. And I'm not saying that's good or bad. I just think it's maybe factually true that we no longer had that convenient and maybe healthy enemy at that. I'm saying this poorly. I don't think it's good we had a Soviet Union. I'm glad they're gone. But I think in that counterbalance, we understood something about ourselves that we've lost and are only slowly regaining as we're seeing China becoming this great world power. But they're doing it seductively. Soviets were never seductive. They were gray, ugly old men, right? I mean, that's, Chinese are, they give us everything, right? Cheap cost. They're very, very good at it. Very good.
We have another question? Questions? Yes, back here. Danny, can you get I have to pass the microphone down. Keep your hand up, yeah, so they can see. Great.
Okay, so what can we as students do to help
Sure.
pull our nation out of this downward spiral?
Well, yeah, thank you. And there are a lot of things. And of course, in some ways, I could just be that cranky old guy up here, right? And I understand that. There are a lot of things. So my kids, I have quite a few kids, but my two oldest are in college right now. So they're roughly your age. And this is something we talk about a lot. And my wife's also an academic, so we've got a very nerdy home, which is a lot of fun, actually. But we talk about this. And, it's interesting. One of the things, so I quoted Russell Kirk earlier. And one of the things Kirk always cautioned about was when we discover these problems, we want to solve them immediately because we believe in justice. It's in us. We love justice. We want to do the right thing. I think even the left, people I don't necessarily agree with, I think are seeking justice. I think they're going about it the wrong way generally, but I think they're seeking it. I think we all want it in some way. So when you're 20 or 21, you want so badly to put your great energy, which you have wonderful amounts of energy, and you want to put that against this issue and take it out immediately. And one of the things that Russell Kirk always said, and not to be a downer at all, quite the opposite, he always said that we have to realize that we really can only change ourselves, and then we can work on our neighbors and those we love. And real change is difficult. Real change takes years. It's not something that we're going to change overnight with a new tax or a new subsidy or a new law. We've got to make sure that we can change things slowly, and they'll become permanent then, or at least as permanent as human existence ever is. So real work is convincing your neighbor that you're right on this. You don't like abortion? Talk about it with your neighbor. Be open about it. Tell them why you don't think it's right. Not just in sound bites, but actually have a real discussion. And if your neighbor is thinking about it, actually help them, fund them, help make sure that they carry the baby to term. There are all different kinds of ways that we can do this. And Kirk said that ultimately we often miss that there's this solution right next to us because we want so badly to solve all of our problems at once that in fact, really, this is kind of a cascading thing. We solve one and then another, and we spread our goodness that way. We spread the light of Christ ultimately by doing that. So please don't take this in the wrong way. I want you to change the world. I really want you to, and I hope that you will. But the chances are good that you'll change it best by changing yourself, not you personally, but changing oneself and then changing our neighbor and having good families, being a good citizen in your neighborhood. Those things really do matter. And when you see error, challenge it. Now, let that error know what's wrong, which is not easy to do. Sometimes, especially when the Twitter mob is after you, it's not easy. Even for us 52-year-old guys, it's not always easy, believe me. So thank you.
Another question here?
Yeah, you've got another hand right back here.
Great. Hold on 1 sec so we can get you the microphone.
Well, I've got a pretty good voice.
All right. Thank you.
Sorry. But I'm one of the group that was born in, and I'm older than you, 1945. So I taught school in the 1960s, starting in 1969. Of course, there's a lot more
timing.
before that, but I went to the University of Nebraska. I taught in right outside Omaha, and they started a pilot program that was called the Open Concept School.
Sure.
And people were kind of against this whole thing. It was like we had to educate the parents about this. But it was a wonderful system, really, if it had gone on. Later on, then I went down to Phoenix, Arizona, and I taught 7th and 8th grade kids down there. Now, in 1969, 1970, when I was down there, you could see the constant situation of what they were taking out of the school system, okay? As to the history of our country, the things that had to do with the Constitution, a few of those things that were put in,
Sure.
you know. And this killed me, because in 1984, I had kids coming in, they were playing the Stars and Stripes Forever, and they said, how come they keep playing that circus music? And at that point down there, they had K through 8. They hadn't gone into the middle school type of situation. And the second grade teacher, I said, this has got to be changed. I said, when I was in school in February, we had patriotic programs. We did a lot of things that way to educate the children. I mean, they tried to take parents out of the school system more so than leave them in to come in and help and see what was going on, you know, later on.
Do you have
Eh,
can we
huh?
jump to the question for Dr. Birzer?
Well, I'm just saying, this is what has happened in our school systems that people don't realize, and we really ended up doing a great thing where we got the parents together to come back in and really educated those kids as to what the United States was about and what was going on. But you have to stand up to administration and stuff like that. You have to be willing
It's a
to
never-ending
say,
battle,
that's
isn't
it, and I'm not going any further. But I'm just saying, yes, it's happened, and it's sickening to me. So.
Thank you. Thanks. And thanks for your good work, too. Yeah, thank you. Good.
Do you have any other questions for Dr. Birzer? Yes, ma'am, right here. We'll get a microphone from Danny. Second row. They're all coming from this side, eh? That's the faculty over here. Yeah.
I realize this might be a bit explosive, but thank you, first of all, Dr. Birzer, my former professor, for the beautiful presentation. In light of the 2020 elections, and looking back over what you have told us about our origins and the positiveness of that despite the negativity that's being poured over it, could you just give us some of your thoughts about the next election period? Anything you want to say?
Thanks, Linda. Yeah, thank you, Linda. I don't really have, I don't think, any well-established or good view on 2020. I actually think Trump's going to be reelected. I don't think it's going to be that close of an election. I think he's going to trounce the Democrats. I think it's been building up for a long time. I think that he's got things in place. I'm not going to say if that's, you know, I'm not going to pass judgment on that, but I just think he's got things very well in hand right now. And the Democrats are at a point where not only is their field huge, but that's not a problem. We've had large fields before, but they're outdoing themselves to see how radical they can each be, and that's just not going to play well. You know, they're narrowing. Trump is gaining in terms of the voter base as the Democrats are diminishing it. Now, maybe when the Democrats get their candidate, they'll come back to a much more moderate conservative position. But, you know, I mean, if the press holds them accountable, which they may or may not, it's going to be really interesting to see what happens. So, but I don't think my guess is any better than yours, Linda, on this. I mean, anything could happen between now and then. I mean, none of us ever envisioned a 9/11. We never envisioned. I mean, anything could happen, and we just don't know, you know, what's going to play out. But I think right now Trump is playing I think he's playing in a way that the left just keeps getting more and more horrified by him, and the average American says, yeah, maybe you should be, he's saying the right thing in ways that they weren't necessarily 2 years ago. So I don't know if that answers you, but I'm not good on politics, so yeah. Let's get back to good philosophy. I'm joking. Thank you, Linda, very much.
We just need it for the people at home.
We need it for the...
follow up on that. Why don't you address this situation with the Electoral College? I mean, this is, you talk about a subject that's really bizarre. It's what's going on now, and especially here in Colorado.
Yeah, no, the Electoral College, especially. I told at dinner tonight, nothing is ever uninteresting here, right? Why can't you Coloradans just calm down a little? It's like everything from psychedelic mushrooms to the Electoral College. I say that with love and respect, at least a part of that. No, I mean, this is an amazing thing that suddenly the Electoral College, of course, because it's inconvenient. And it's meant to be inconvenient. Its whole point is to be inconvenient. We are not supposed to be having a direct election of the president. We are supposed to be electing through our representatives in the Electoral College. And the founders didn't set this up to protect slavery. They did this because this was a very traditional Republican way of making sure that your executive never had too much power. Andrew Jackson is the very first president to ever declare that he is the embodiment of the American people. And as much as I respect Jackson, I think that was a terrible decision on his part, because no president, even Ronald Reagan, who was beloved by the American people, Ronald Reagan was not the embodiment of the American people. He was our executive. And the embodiment of the American people, properly by the Constitution, must be in its communities and as expressed by their representatives in the House. And that's it, right? And so I'm sorry, I get worked up about this. I don't get so worked up about Trump, but I get worked up about the Electoral College. No, I mean, this is part of the incredible checks and balances that the founders painstakingly put into the Constitution. And we will lose the Republic if we get rid of that. It's over. I mean, it is truly over if that's gone. So not to be too dour, but it really is. Yeah. So, yeah. How's that after that message of hope? Thank you. Now I am getting into cranky old man mode. Brad here.
Thank you, Dr. Birzer. I appreciate your presentation today.
Brad. It's good to see you.
It's always good. He's a BB, I'm a BB. I wanted to know if you would address the idea of patriotism. You mentioned it in your presentation. Many people think it's grounded in the land or in a celebration or voting, but really patriotism defined correctly is about the rights of the individual, and you mentioned the dignity of the individual. So you can speak to that.
Sure. Thanks, Brad. This is a great question, and patriotism has been one of those questions that's been debated and talked about since the very beginning of Western civilization. And we generally owe what we think of patriotism to the Romans, not to the Greeks. There is Greek patriotism. Herodotus clearly was a Greek patriot, but it's really in the Roman system with the patriarchs and the kind of patriarchal system that we see there where we get that idea. But patriotism is really just this very simple notion that we love those around us. Edmund Burke had this great, in a discussion of patriotism, he has this beautiful, and of course Burke is always beautiful in his writing, but he said, when we're thinking about being patriotic, we must understand that for us to love our country must be lovely. And I think there's something, this is why, yes, the founding had problems. There's no question about that. And I wish, I really wish that the founders had not allowed for the 3 compromises on slavery. I can't imagine there's a person in this room who would want it any other way. But it's a fact of life that they did allow it, and partly because they wanted to keep South Carolina and Georgia in. And yet they still had this understanding that we must protect what is ours. Forget slavery for a moment. Think about New England. We have to be able to understand what our community is, whether, it's where you guys live. You're in Erie, right? I mean, whether it's that or Lakewood or wherever we may be, that we find these things good. And so the patriotism, I think, especially for us as Americans, we should be patriotic to the good things, the things that are lovely. And who else in the world has said all men are created equal? That's in one document. Now it's elsewhere, but that had never been said before. Nobody had ever put it exactly like that. And granted, the founders didn't live it out perfectly, but once you make that statement, as Martin Luther King said, it's a promissory note. You've got to play it out. That's the founding, right? And that to me is patriotism. It's a belief, not just that America is right no matter what. We've done horrible things as a people. We've done, and we should be if we can take pride in George Washington for being a great leader, we have to also recognize we had a Richard Nixon there. We have to recognize those things. And there were good things about Nixon, but we have to recognize that there's good and bad, and we have to be able to take that in I think, in a lot of different ways. I don't think we should just be straightforward nationalists, no matter what America does. I think we need to say America when she's right, and we need to promote what's right about that. So to me, that's patriotism, at least as I understand it traditionally. So yeah, thanks, Brad. Good.
Question back here from a student, and then we'll go over here. Go ahead.
Yes, sir. So in light of all the attacks...
Weren't you in class this morning?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You asked a question then, too. Thank you.
In light of the attacks, both on the Electoral College and
Sure.
traditional patriotism in the U.S., how can we as students also address the seeming hatred of the First Amendment and free speech on college campuses, especially?
Yeah, isn't that interesting? The place where we should be open and talk about these things is the one place that is even more dangerous than Twitter is. Yeah, no, I mean, this is a great question, and your question this morning was great too, so thank you. You're obviously, you're a cool guy. I mean, I do think part of it is kind of like what your fellow student asked earlier. I mean, I do think that some of these things just have to be challenged at the moment, but we also have to do it in a right way, right? If we just get super angry, which we may be justified in doing, you're not going to convince anyone. They're going to get angrier, and you're probably going to, something either bad's going to happen or you're going to walk away from each other, and that's not healthy. I mean, I do think we need to learn ways like Reagan did. I mean, notice what Reagan said. Reagan spoke to his audience, right? He understood it. He didn't compromise his views at all, but he spoke to his audience. And I think there's something, this is where Trump does not, I mean, he does speak to his audience, but the media doesn't get it because they're not his audience, right? They're missing that. And so he is speaking to his audience, but it's not in the way that Reagan did. Reagan was an actor. He had that cool, he had the great voice. He knew how to modulate. He knew what to say. He had quotes. He had a nearly photographic memory. He was a genius. He just knew when to say the right thing at the right time. But part of what he did was he always made friends. And there was a joke on Capitol Hill that when he was president, people like Tip O'Neill, another Irishman, they should have been best buddies. Tip O'Neill took a few days to go over and meet Reagan because he knew that he'd like him and he didn't want to. Yeah, that's who we should be. We should be that guy. We should be the guy who can win people over that way. And that doesn't mean there aren't times we shouldn't get our backs up. There are times we should, definitely. I mean, Leonidas is a perfect example of that. But those are extraordinary situations. In most situations, I think we should take the Reagan model. Yeah. So be good, young man. Right?
I think we got a question here. This will probably be our final question.
Good. Thank you.
I'm wondering about your thoughts on the intersectionality movement. Is there a historical precedent to it, or a good response in your estimation to it?
Thank you. I have to say that whole movement confuses me. And I've tried to study it, and I really have a hard. I don't know. I don't know if it's my mindset. I have a very difficult time getting around what the arguments are within it. And I've wondered, being within it, what would it look like? How would a person kind of see the world? And it seems like a very dark view from what I can tell in terms of just not really having any, I don't know enough about it to go too much into what I think on it. But I do think it's an interesting movement at the moment. And I think it's something that we probably, especially those of us who are not on the left, we probably need to think of ways to counter it. The only equivalent, and I could, Michael, you're out here better than me. I do, when I read it, I do think of some certain ancient Greeks who, especially those who were taking on Socrates, there's certain schools of sophism that kind of remind me of it. But Michael, do you want to, he's actually an expert on all of this, so. 29 seconds.
We're thinking through that now here.
Right.
Yeah, it's one of those things
Thanks, Michael. Sorry to put you on the spot. Poor guy. He just came here to watch it talk. Okay. Yeah. Sorry. I mean, that's a great question, but I think it is. I think it in and of itself is evolving, and I think any kind of response to it is evolving as well. So was there a reason you were asking about it in particular? It's the new thing. Yeah. Right. It certainly seems that way to me. And divisive, not for any other real reason except to be divisive. That's why I think with this New York Times thing as well. I mean, clearly their agenda is to undermine. It's not to build up at all. If we wanted to talk about Black history, great. Let's talk about Black history. That's very different from focusing our entire country and our history on this one moment, as this dread. I mean, can you imagine if each of us were defined by the worst thing we ever did? Oh my gosh. Yeah, there'd be no hope left. I mean, it's insane. So, yeah, thank you.
Great.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much, everybody. Thanks for letting me pontificate, too.
All right, I have a few closing announcements, but I will not violate Colorado's 11th commandment to miss a Broncos game, so we'll finish up here soon. But that's a great idea for a future Centennial Institute event, so I think you'll probably see that coming soon. So thank you. We have a few upcoming events I want to make sure that we highlight so that you're aware of them. Tomorrow we're going to be partnering with the Archdiocese of Denver on an event called Made This Way. It's going to be dealing with transgenderism, so you can find that on our website. That is going to be hosted at St. Thomas More Catholic Church. We're going to host a number of 9/11 events. We're going to be doing flags out in front of Loprino. And at 9:11 a.m., please gather with us as we pray to remember what happened in 9/11, pray for our country and pray for justice. And then finally, our next Distinguished Lecture Series will be another combination with the President's Office and the President's Lecture Series, where we'll be hosting Dr. Philip Jenkins. And I want to read you the description here real quick because I don't think you're going to want to miss this. One of America's foremost scholars of religion examines the tumultuous era that gave birth to the modern Judeo-Christian tradition. In The Crucible of Faith, Dr. Philip Jenkins argues that much of the Judeo-Christian tradition we know today was born between 250 and 50 BCE during a turbulent crucible era. It was during these years that Judaism grappled with Hellenizing forces and produced new religious ideas that reflected and responded to their changing world. By the time of the fall of the temple in 70 CE, concepts that might once have seemed bizarre became normalized and thus passed on to Christianity and later Islam. Drawing widely on contemporary sources from outside the canonical Old and New Testaments, Jenkins reveals an era of political violence and social upheaval that ultimately gave birth to the entirely new ideas about religion, the afterlife, creation, and the fall, and the nature of God and Satan. That will be October 14th in the Anschutz Student Center at 7 p.m., so I hope you'll join us for that. Thank you all so much for being a wonderful audience. We look forward to seeing you next time. God bless you.